Terra sat impatiently on the black monstrosity of a throne Gareth Ursul had built. It had taken her half the morning to soothe the Lycanat and Chantry ambassadors. Her attempts to figure out who'd arranged her diplomatic disaster had been futile. Fingers pointed this way and that, and there was no telling who was lying. Finally, Luke came in, resplendent in his cloth of gold Lord General's cloak, calfskin boots, and trim white tunic and breeches.
The rumors are true! Logan has arrived with 1,400 men!
They didn't lose anyone breaking through the Curran army?
They didn't break through. They signed a treaty. When I demanded to know by what right they'd negotiated a treaty, they said by yours. They were surprised I didn't know.
Terra sagged into the throne. This had the Sakage's grubby fingerprints all over it.
What are the details of the treaty?
I didn't ask.
Idiot!
There are Curran wagons full of rice and grain going to every corner of the city. They're giving the Currans food to our people.
They let the Curran army inside the walls?
Just Lantano Gorowashi and the wagons. But the gates are still open. People are going out to the Curran camp and celebrating with them.
In minutes, Terra was on a balcony looking over the city. It was a crisp autumn day, the sun bright but barely warm. Vanden Bridge was aglitter with sunlight reflected off hundreds of men in armor.
Logan's parading through the Warrens. Why would he do such a thing? Who would feel safe there?
The rabbits worship him.
The procession filed back to the east side and turned toward the castle. The streets had been crowded when Terra's army had paraded, but as Logan came, the city seemed to have emptied itself.
Summon my advisors. I need to know everything about this treaty before Gorowashi reaches the castle. Is he my ally, my vassal, or my overlord? God forbid, is he my husband? Go, Luke, go!
After applying the appropriate makeup, Kylo secured Retribution to his back, dressed in loose rags, so stinking and filthy he was loath to wear them, and donned a satchel full of noblemen's clothes. He reset the door's traps with poisons that would sicken but not kill, and then perched on the ladder. It was early morning now, and the exit was blind. He waited one more second as he drew the Kakari over his clothing and went invisible. He threw open the flagstone as a wagon passed overhead, crawled out, spun in his stomach, dropped the hidden door closed, and flung dust over the clean flagstone. The wagon's back axle caught on Retribution. It spun Kylo back around and dragged him for several feet before he twisted free. Kylo stood, invisible, and made his way into an alley. He dropped the shadows and examined his rags to see what damage the Kakari had inflicted on them this time. It wasn't bad, except for a few new holes in the back that might show retribution. He twisted the satchel to lie across his back, effected a limp, and headed for the Heron's Rest. It was at the crossroads of Seidlin and Vanden, and thus one of the few inns in the city where he could enter in rags and leave in silks without attracting attention. He hadn't gone 2 blocks when he saw the ambush. Guild kids were hiding amid the ashes and rubble that clotted the alley. Most of them held rocks, but he caught glimpses of 1 or 2 clutching Caladoran swords, relics, no doubt, of the Nocta Hamata. There was time to turn aside, but Kylo didn't, for one reason. He saw Blue. He'd forgotten to hide the money he'd promised her. She might have even lived up to her side of the bargain and moved her crew, though he doubted it. The biggest kid in the guild was the first to stand up. He was short for 16, and gaunt like all of them, though he didn't have the distended belly of malnourishment that some of the littles had. He held a Caladoran sword, and his eyes darted around to the other kids for support.
Give us your coin, and that bag, and you can go.
Kylo looked around the circle. 17 of them, all scared witless, most of them littles. Blue was squinting at him suspiciously. He grinned at her.
I forgot to give you this.
Kylo fished in a pocket for a gold coin. It was far more than he'd promised, but these kids could use it. He tossed it to her. One of the bigs mistook the move and whipped his rock at Kylo's head. Kylo dodged, and the missile nearly brained another big on the other side. In a moment, the circle exploded in flying rocks and slashing steel. With a surge of talent, Kylo leapt 10 feet in the air, flipped, drew Retribution, and coated it with the Kakari. As he landed, he spun in a circle, hacking the blades from the hilts of 3 swords. From Retribution, the Kakari released a pulse of magic that rushed over Kylo's skin.
What was that?
Impressive. Look.
The guild had frozen, and even those bigs who were suddenly holding broken swords were staring at Kyler, not their swords. He glanced at himself and saw that somehow he'd lost his tunic, and his skin was shining as if lit from within, as if he were bursting with barely restrained power.
I didn't tell you to do that.
You wanted to stop them without killing them, didn't you?
I told you it was him.
Kyler had an awful feeling of deja vu. The thought he was Durzo. Had the Kakari put that face on him, too? He was standing as Durzo had stood over a decade ago when Azoth's guild had tried to mug him. But now he was standing on Durzo's side. It looked different from here.
It's Kyler.
How do you know that name?
I heard Jarl talking at Mama Kay's once. He said you were his best friend. He said you used to be black dragons. And Mama Kay told us once that the best black dragon ever apprenticed with Durzo Blint. I put it together.
Kyler couldn't move.
The truth always comes out.
If these kids knew that Kyler was a wet boy and Durzo's apprentice, there was no telling how long before an enemy knew it. It might have spilled already, or his enemies might never think to ask a bunch of guild rats. There was no way to know. It wasn't Kyler's fault, but Kyler had to disappear. His time was finished. If he ever came back to Sonaria, it would have to be as a different man with a different name and different friends, or none. Kyler would have to abandon everything, as Durzo had abandoned everything every 10 or 20 years. It was the price of immortality.
Please, sir. Apprentice Blue. She's the smartest. She deserves to get out.
You think this is out? I'll be dead inside a week.
Kyler pulled the Kakari to his skin and sent a jolt of blue fire through it. The kids threw up their hands to shield their eyes, and when they looked again, Kyler was gone. Followed by generals, bodyguards, Lord Agon, and a bluff Kurin named Otaru Tamaki, Logan and Lantano Garawashi strode into the throne room. Logan knelt before the throne, as did the other Cenarians. The Kurins bowed low. Lantano Garawashi inclined his head.
Arise.
Queen Grayson was warmly regal in a soft red gown with emerald piping and matching jewels at her ears and throat. She descended the 7 steps to where Garawashi and Logan stood.
Duke Gaia, you have served us excellently. We shall reward you as richly as you deserve.
She turned to Lantano Garawashi.
Your Highness, it is an honor. Be welcome in our court.
Logan barely kept from breathing a sigh of relief. So, she had gotten his letters after all. There had been something odd in her replies, a lack of the expected sneer. Perhaps she had decided that with her rule secure, she should start acting more like a queen.
Please, call me Garawashi. I'm no king yet.
Nor am I a queen yet. Though it would please me greatly if you would be my guest at my coronation.
I would be honored. And perhaps by this time next year, you can be my guest at mine.
May I show you around my castle?
Tara extended her hand to Garawashi and dismissed the rest of them. From the looks in their eyes, Logan expected Lantano Garawashi would be mounting the ramparts in no time. Her name was Precia. She was the 14-year-old concubine who had wept for her friends and not for herself when Gareth died. She'd hanged herself with a silk belt. She was naked, her clothing folded neatly in a pile to one side, all her beauty gone. Her face was discolored, eyes open and bulging, tongue protruding, shit running down her fair legs. Dorian touched her and found her body only slightly cooled. From his touch, her body swung slightly. It was obscene. Dorian rubbed his face. He should have known. The concubines had probably learned that Gareth's body had been recovered even before Dorian had. For the God King's bodyguards, the recovery meant a small reclamation of honor. To the concubines, it meant death. The former God King's wives would be expected to join him on his pyre. Only the virgins and the concubines the next God King desired would be spared. Dorian had said he was claiming no one. The women thought they would all be burned.
When did you figure it out, Hopper?
Your Holiness?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Try again.
I was with the rest of the concubines. Priscia came into this room to fetch something. I had no idea.
Try again.
Hopper searched Dorian's face, his eyes wide, panicky. He must have seen something that satisfied him.
I knew you were an Ursel after I told you that you seemed different. An eccentric slave would continue as before. A pretender would redouble his efforts to appear servile.
What is your position within the God King's hands?
I am their chief.
So it was as Janine had suspected. Who better to keep an eye on the God King's people and secrets than a eunuch whose awkward gait made him seem a buffoon? Hopper was at the confluence of the God King's eunuchs, concubines, and wives and servants. Through them he had eyes on every important Verdmeister, Atheling, and general in the realm.
How did you really lose your toes?
When His Holiness, your father, offered me the position, he said that would be part of the price. I welcome the chance to make such a sacrifice. Being gelded, on the other hand, wasn't so welcome.
He offered? Did you have the option to refuse?
Yes, His Holiness was always fair with us.
It was a new side to Gareth Ursul, a kinder side than Dorian had known. It was unsettling.
Why didn't you expose me?
Because I didn't have anyone to report to, and I didn't know what you were trying to accomplish. By the time I did, you had accomplished it. It was, if you will pardon my presumption, one of my few failures as chief of the hands.
No wonder he didn't know what I intended. I didn't intend it.
Your Holiness, I suspect some of the Aethelings and Voidmeisters know what I am. I guard against mundane spying, but I have not the means to stop their fear.
It was astonishing how Dorian had blundered into success. He'd kept Hopper in the throne room the day he had seized power. The Verdmeisters had come into the room and had seen not only a fearless Dorian, but Hopper off to one side, tacitly endorsing him. How much weight had that carried?
What is your name, Hopper? Your real name?
I was ordered to forget. I'm sorry. Sire, my name was Vondias Hill.
I thought Clan Hill was annihilated.
The God King saved me from the flesh pots. He thought I had potential. I did my best to prove him right.
The flesh pots. So the Krull and their feeding habits were no great secret.
Vondias Hill, I will remember your name and the sacrifices you have made. Will you serve me as the chief of my hands?
Vondias bowed low.
I have questions for you. Where are my 200 missing Verdmeisters?
Verdmeister Nefdada sounded a religious summons when His Holiness your father died. He called all Verdmeisters to help him bring Kali home. Currently, your hands believe them to be in your eastern lands.
Eastern Calidor was sparsely populated. There were no major cities there and hadn't been since Jorson Alcestis had turned Trethel into Black Barrow.
They're at Black Barrow?
In its vicinity, at least. We don't know the exact location. Spies who've attempted to infiltrate the camp haven't returned.
That at least was one problem that could wait. Meisters and Magi, Verdmeisters and Archmagi had been smashing themselves against Black Barrow for centuries. Nefdada, at the head of 200 Verdmeisters, was a serious problem, but at least Dorian would have until spring to consolidate his forces. And Nef wouldn't bother putting together an army. All Dorian's former tutor cared about was magic. Still, it was a problem that bore looking into.
Redouble your efforts. I want to know what they're trying, and what, if anything, they've accomplished.
Yes, Your Holiness.
How many Aethelings are completing their Uerdans?
17 that I know of.
How many of those are in position to form a credible threat to me in the next 6 months?
You must understand, Your Holiness. Your father kept secrets, even from me. So anything I tell you is complete to the best of my knowledge. And I did know more than he knew I did. But I cannot have full confidence that I knew all of his Aethelings. I know that Moburu Ander lives and is attempting to subvert the wild men. I have reports that he believes himself to be some kind of prophesized high king. Your father cared little about that. He cared more that there appeared to be some evidence of collusion between Nefdada and Moburu, though he and I believe any association between the two to be tenuous at best.
Yes. I can't imagine Nef letting anyone leave after they've served his purpose. Nor would one of my brothers.
The only other Eighthling I know about was one I was not supposed to know, and I never learned his name. He was part of a delegation of war magi that Shokendi sent to recover Kurok. The magi made it as far as Senaria and witnessed the Battle of Pavel's Grove, then returned to Shokendi, satisfied that Kurok was not present.
Dorian scowled. He had been certain that some of his brothers must be attempting to infiltrate the School of Fire as he had been sent to the School of Healing, but learning that one had been successful left a sick taste of betrayal in his mouth. He knew most of the magi that might have been sent on such a mission. Had he been friends with one of his own traitorous brothers? He shook his head. That was a distraction. Moburu and Nef were the real problem, and surviving until he could consolidate his men against them.
Very well, Hopper. Thank you.
Hopper bowed once more, and when he straightened, he wore the slightly befuddled expression of Hopper once more. Janine came into the room.
Dorian? Dorian, I've been looking all over for you.
Janine wore a shy smile. From where she stood, she couldn't see Priscia's hanged body. She was dressed in a simple gown of green silk that was gathered under her breasts.
I've made my decision. I will marry you, Dorian, and I will learn to love you as you love me.
Janine, you shouldn't.
But he was too late. Janine saw the hanged, naked body and the first expression on the face of the woman he loved upon their betrothal.
Oh, God!
I killed her.
What?
She killed herself, rather than be forced to burn on Garroth's pyre.
Hopper, please take care of her, and double the watches on the concubines. Janine, I need you to help me make a hard decision. It may have consequences for our engagement.
V poured cold water into the basin from a copper pitcher and splashed her face. On the narrow desk by the door, she saw a note addressed to Viridiana. V didn't touch it. She'd get ready when she was good and ready. The room was terrible, more like a broom closet. The unfinished stone walls were barely far apart enough to fit the narrow bed with its thin straw mattress. At the foot of the bed was a chest for her belongings and the wash basin. The chest was empty. They'd even taken V's hair ties. Tyros possessed only what the chantry gave them. In V's case, that meant one ill-fitting white Tyros dress. The infuriating thing was that she knew that they had a dress that fit perfectly, as if Master Pakun had a fit of genius as he worked with what should have been terminally uninspiring wool and had somehow conquered the cloth to make V look beautiful. That, obviously, was not the intended effect. The dress had been spirited away and this white sack put in its place. They hadn't bothered tailoring a shift for her. The one she'd woken in was obviously used, if she hoped clean, and the previous owner had been fatter than she was tall. The shift didn't even come down to V's knees. V brushed her hair back irritably. They'd taken her damn hair ties. She wasn't going to her lectures. She wasn't leaving the room. They'd taken enough. She looked around the room for something she could use. Her eyes fell on the copper pitcher.
To hell with them!
She ripped off the handle. In a minute, her hair was pulled back into a fiercely tight braid.
To hell with them!
She squeezed the copper into a tight circle binding her hair. She picked up the note and unfolded it.
Viridiana, after your classes this morning, please come to the private dining hall. Eileen wishes to meet you. Sister Ariel.
V couldn't breathe. Eileen. Oh, fuck. She'd known Eileen would show up eventually, but so soon. The door burst open and a wild-eyed, frumpy teenager stared around the room suspiciously, her arms raised as if she were summoning vast powers.
What's going on here? You were using magic twice. Don't deny it.
The girl's cheeks were flushed, sweat beading on her pale forehead under dark hair. She was fat enough and short enough that V wondered if this lard barrel had been the prior owner of her shift. She was perhaps 15, her white cotton dress edged with blue, and a brooch of gold scales prominent on her chest.
You got me.
You admit it!
Of course. Now get out and knock next time.
It's forbidden!
Knocking's forbidden?
No.
Then try it next time, chunky.
My name is Sandra, and I'm the floor monitor. You use magic twice. That's 2 days in the scullery for your first offense. And you disrespected me. That's a week.
You little shit.
Swearing, another day. They told me you'd be trouble.
You've got to be fucking joking.
Disrespect! Swearing again! That's it! You'll report to the Mistress Jonasa for switching immediately!
You call that disrespect, you squealing sow?
V grabbed the girl's arm, twisted, and heaved her out of the room. As V stepped into the hall, she saw at least 30 little girls staring at her wide-eyed, most of them under 12.
Please, knock next time.
In all his life, Kyler had never seen the people of the Warren so happy. Agon's dogs had stayed with the wagons full of grain and rice to manage the distribution. All the dogs were members of the Sakage, and they had taken it into their minds to make sure that the food was fairly distributed.
We got our bit coming! I've heard it from high up! Now make sure those guild rats share!
A woman soon had several pots boiling, and anyone who dropped a measure of their rice or grain into one pot immediately could take a full seasoned measure from another. She served bread and rice and soon wine. Someone offered herbs, someone else butter, another meat. In no time, it was a feast. Kyler glimpsed a lean woman with long blonde hair on the far side of the square. In contrast to the rabbits, she was so clean she was radiant, and he caught a flash of white teeth as she smiled. His heart stopped.
Eileen?
The woman disappeared around a corner. Kyler went after her, pushing and dodging his way through the jubilant crowd. When he got to the corner, she was already 50 paces down the twisting alley, turning onto yet another.
Eileen!
Kyler grabbed her shoulder.
Hi! Kyler, right?
Daedra had been one of Mama Kay's girls. Playing the Virgin was her specialty. From a distance, she looked like Eileen. Kyler's heart lurched, and he wasn't sure if it was more from disappointment or relief. He didn't want Eileen here. He didn't want her in this pit of a city, or anywhere nearby when he murdered the Queen. But at the same time, he wanted to see her so badly it ached.
I don't work the sheets anymore, Kyler.
No, I wasn't. I'm sorry. I thought you were someone else.
Kyler turned and made his way to the castle. Fear Cassat and Antoninus Wervel emerged from Korig's past afternoon. As they approached Black Barrow, the evergreen forest that carpeted the foothills ended. Fear hunkered down in his coat against the deep autumn chill and climbed a low rise. The sight took his breath away. No one had lived in Black Barrow for 700 years. The land should have been long overgrown with grass, trees, undergrowth. It wasn't. The grass, at the least, should have been an autumnal brown. It wasn't. 7 centuries ago, the decisive battle of the War of Shadow had been fought in the early summer, and the grass at Fear's feet was still short and green. He saw the raw depression where a farmer's stone fence had been pulled from the earth, the stones taken into the city so that they might not be used as missiles by the enemy's siege engines. Nothing had grown in the bare depressions that marked where this fence had stood, seemingly only days before. Time had stopped here. Lifting his eyes, Fear saw more. Ruts from the passage of wagons, grass beaten flat by marching feet, holes for the fire pits and latrine pits of an abandoned military camp. But no tents or tools. Anything that could be looted had been taken long ago, but everything that remained stayed unchanged. that didn't only apply to the land. 200 paces away, the bodies began. First, a few marking the edge of the battle, and then hundreds, and then thousands, until in the distance the ground lay under a black blanket of the dead. The epicenter of death was a perfectly round dome of black rock, the size of a small mountain covering the city and the hill where the castle had once been. At the base of the dome, siege engines on broken wheels, half consumed by fires, tottered, but hadn't fallen despite the centuries. The dome was surrounded by a large circle of magic in the land itself, miles across, called the Dead Domain. Outside the circle, time continued. Wind blew, rain fell. Inside the Dead Domain, they didn't. Fear rolled his great shoulders, readying himself. He cupped his hands close to his face and conjured a fire with his talent. Then he stepped across the boundary into the circle of death. Nothing happened. He let the fire die.
Oh, that's odd.
Fear squinted at the air. The Dead Domain, like Black Barrow itself, was Emperor Jorsen Alcestis's work. He had made it lethal to use the Vir within the circle, but because Vir had similarities to the talent, there was always some dissonance in the circle when anyone tried using the talent. Little things would be different, like mage fire being red instead of orange. But Alcestis's weave was gone. Fear rubbed his scruffy beard. It was good for him. He wouldn't have to factor it into the work he'd come here to do. But someone had broken what Jorsen made. That was not good. Examining the air over the circle in the same way he had examined the circle in Ezra's wood, Fear studied the magic. He could feel an emptiness in the weaves. The great magics Jorsen had woven didn't break without leaving a trace. Unfortunately, he couldn't tell much except that the weaves had been broken recently. But to break a spell Jorsen Alcestis had made using Kurak would have required someone incredibly powerful here, wielding some artifact or a couple of hundred magi or Verdmeisters working together. Fear couldn't imagine anyone with a shred of sense or decency participating in such a scheme. So that meant Verdmeisters. Jorsen's other weaves, the ones sealing the ground and sealing the dead, were perfectly intact. Fear didn't think they would be so easily broken either. He hoped not. Fear scanned the distant trees, suddenly queasy that unfriendly eyes might be hiding within them. He walked across the plain quickly, the air curiously odorless even as he approached the first body. The creature was the black of a bloated corpse and man-shaped but ill-proportioned. Its arms were too long, its face too long, lower jaw jutting forward, ragged hooks of teeth stabbing up into the air from its lower jaw, mismatched black and blue eyes staring. It was massively muscled. Its skin was hairy, bordering on fur, and it had neither clothes nor weapon. It was a crawl. The Meisters could not make life, but they could mimic and mock it. There were, Dorian had once told Fear, dark mirrors of almost every natural creation. Fear and Antoninus walked on. It was going to get worse, a lot worse. Soon dead Krull lay everywhere. Thousands had been killed bloodlessly by Jorsen's magic, but thousands more bore the marks of their deaths. Ugly faces had been crushed by war hammers or flailing hooves. Chests were caved in from being trampled. Throats were cut, torsos disemboweled, eyes hung by optic nerves from broken sockets, and blood glistened freshly in the wounds, never drying, never congealing. Paths had been cleared through the bodies, and they followed them mutely. It wasn't long before Fear saw a human arm amid the crawl, then a leg that appeared to have been half-eaten. The bodies were piled knee-deep on either side of him. Then they began passing Krull who'd been killed by magic. There were great craters in the battlefield, empty of all but pulverized scraps of meat. Others had been burned or cut in half or shot. Some had torn their faces to ribbons with their own claws. The Krull began to vary, too. Pure white Krull with spiraling ram's horns led every unit of 12, and larger ones 7 feet tall appeared more rarely still. They walked past an entire platoon of 4-legged feline Krull the size of horses, with jet black skin, sparse hair like a rat's tail, and exaggerated maws like a wolf. Rarer still were those like bears, easily 12 feet tall and with thick fur the color of new blood. As they trekked through the vast battlefield, it seemed every natural animal had found a dark mockery here. Bats, ravens, eagles, fanged horses, horned horses, even dark red-eyed elephants carrying archers lay in ignominious death.
The monsters. Was nothing holy to them?
Fear followed Antoninus's gaze and saw the Krull children. They were most beautiful of all the Krull, with balanced features, big child's eyes, pale skin close to a human shade, and long claws for fingers. These still wore their human clothes. Even the looters hadn't touched them. Fear almost gagged. They moved on, ever closer to the great black dome. After a while, Fear felt inured to the horror. There were 1,000 permutations of death. Krull of every shape and size, and sometimes men and often horses, but the magical fixedness of it, the lack of smell, the stillness of the air, lent it a certain unreality, as if the dead were figures carved of wax. If Jorson was to be believed, 1,113,879 Krull lay dead here. Various Magi scholars had guessed that between 500,000 and 1 million Krull would face them, against 50,000 men. The rest of Jorson's armies had been drawn away by his own treacherous generals. Then Jorson had done all this with Kurok, the very blade Fear had gone into the wood to retrieve. Of course, he had only retrieved instructions. Kurok was safe in Ezra's wood forever, and thank the gods for that.
Well, here we are.
They finally touched the dome of Black Barrow.
Now we can forge our counterfeit Kurkalestos and save Lantano Garuwashi and all his men. Indeed, maybe all the south.
All we have to do is find Ezra's secret entrance to Black Barrow, find Ezra's workshop and his gold tools, find 7 broken Mysteral swords, rediscover a forging technique every present-day maker says is a myth, find 1 giant ruby, and avoid detection by a couple of 100 boardmeisters plotting gods know what.
Oh, here I thought it was going to take all winter.
It was hours later, and V was still in her room.
It's Sister Ariel. May I come in?
I can't stop you. There's no lock on the door. What do you want?
A bit nervous about going to the lecture, huh? Or was it your meeting with Eileen that's got you acting more like a tyrant than a tyro?
I fucked up. Now they hate me, like always.
They're 12 years old. They don't dare hate you.
Is that supposed to make me feel better?
I'm not terribly concerned about your feelings, V. However, given the difficulties of your case, and that I discovered you, and most of all because I couldn't come up with an excuse quickly enough, I've been put in charge of your tutelage.
Oh.
My feelings exactly. First of all, this room is entirely inappropriate for you.
I get a better room?
You get to share a room. You are given a single in deference to your age. That was a mistake. You're isolated enough as it is. As of this afternoon, you'll have a roommate. In case you're curious, the room will be only slightly larger than this one. Now, since you are my responsibility, you'll go to lecture. Now, Eileen will have to wait until later.
V didn't move.
Do we need to repeat certain lessons we learned on the trail?
V stood quickly.
And by the by, lest you being put under my care be seen as a reward, all the punishments that your unfortunate floor monitor imposed will be carried out, as well as a few of my own. Follow.
Ariel left, and V had no choice but to follow her, like a whipped dog. The chantry had been constructed with beauty and practicality as its first considerations. Cost had obviously been no object. Even here in the Tyros area, the arched ceilings were 10 feet high, incised with a different pattern in every quarter. The Tyros occupied the lowest level of the chantry, though storerooms, archives, and the like lay beneath the waterline. Because it was housed entirely within the giant statue of the Seraph, the interior of the chantry was arranged in circles, living quarters arrayed along the quadrisecting halls, and lecture halls around the outside to take advantage of the sunlight necessary for magic. Though white marble predominated, the Tyros floor didn't feel austere. A castle with so much stone could be cold and dark, but here the floors were warmed to welcome bare feet, and the ceiling itself was luminous. The walls were filled with bright, cheery scenes to comfort girls away from home for the first time. Rabbits, unicorns, cats, dogs, horses, and animals V had never seen played together. They were drawn fancifully, but exquisitely. V touched a painted pink puppy curled in sleep next to an impossibly friendly lion. Its eyes opened, and it licked toward her fingers, its pink tongue pressing against the wall as if it were just on the other side of a glass.
His name's Payet. He was one of my favorites. He doesn't wake until noon.
What?
It's a timepiece. Watch this.
Ariel stopped outside one of the classrooms. Gently, the ceilings pulsed violet, red, yellow, green, and blue in succession as a bell tolled. Seconds later, several hundred girls between 10 and 14 poured into the halls. V saw more curious glances than frightened ones. Apparently, the rumors hadn't spread to the entire school yet. She folded her arms and scowled.
Class starts in 5 minutes. Can you read and write?
Of course.
Good. I'll collect you at noon. Oh, and V, if you have a question during class, raise your hand. Sister Gizaden is a stickler. When called on, stand with your hands behind your back. If you don't, they'll think you're being disrespectful. Oh, and no magic. And remember everything. Lectures are arranged in triads to help with.
Triads?
Sister Ariel was already gone. 5 minutes later, V was seated in a too-small chair at a too-small desk in the front row of a lecture hall. 3 walls were unadorned white stone. The east wall, however, was as transparent as glass. The late morning sun poured down, bathing Lake Vestaci and the snow-capped mountains beyond in light. The lake was the deepest blue V had ever seen, and dozens of fishing boats dotted the surface. The wall shimmered, becoming opaque white like the others in seconds. Without preliminaries, Sister Gizaden began.
There are 3 reasons glamour should be used sparingly. Anyone?
Not a girl made a move.
First, glamours are unpredictable. Second, glamours are unnatural. Third, glamours are unappreciated. Unpredictable. First, a glamour may affect only men, or only women, or only children. Second, a glamour may affect some people much more strongly than others. Third, a glamour will attract people according to their own predispositions. It may impart, particularly in men, an overwhelming sexual desire for the caster, or it may impart a slavish servitude, where the person finds in you every good thing they could imagine, or it may impart a simple attractiveness and persuasiveness. Unnatural. First, a glamour can operate by exaggerating a quality you already have. That could be exaggerating your inherent attractiveness, or it could exaggerate people's perception of your courage or honor or strength, or it could exaggerate a bond such as friendship that you share with the glamour's target. Second, a glamour may feign the attractive features of another person. Third, and most powerfully, a glamour may tap the subject's mind for what he finds most attractive. One man might say the caster was blonde and blue-eyed, whilst the man beside him would swear she was buxom and green-eyed. But this type of glamour is unusual and challenging to use. And obviously, if the 2 men talk after the marcher leaves, they will notice the discrepancy. That leads us to the 3rd reason glamours should be used sparingly. Glamours are unappreciated. First, Viridiana, stop fidgeting. You have a question?
What if you can control all that? It's not that hard.
All the girls in the class looked at V as if they couldn't believe she dared speak.
Do you really wish me to believe you have natural mastery of one of the most difficult relational spells?
I didn't say mastery.
Unless you've actually cast the spell, sit and be silent.
I have.
Oh, pray tell.
Fine, bitch. I was fucking this guy, and he was having trouble waking the snake.
Sister Gazaden's eyes went huge.
So I kicked in a sex glamour. That usually does it in about 5 seconds. I mean, it's embarrassing. If you use too much, they're done before they get naked. With this one, the glamour did nothing. In your terms, I guess I was exaggerating my natural attractiveness. So I played around with it until I felt something give. His eyes glazed over and he started talking about my boyish figure while holding 2 hands full of tit.
Sister Gazaden's mouth was open, but no words came out.
Anyway, it wasn't hard. I mean, I'm most experienced with glamour for sex, but I figured those out with a pointer or two from a courtesan. So with sisters teaching me, how hard can the other glamours be?
For a long time, no one said anything. V noticed belatedly that everyone was gaping at her. Sister Gazaden's mouth closed. Finally, she looked past V to a buck-toothed 12-year-old who raised her hand.
Yes, Hannah?
Please, sister. What kind of mage is a courtesan?
Sit! Both of you!
They sat.
Unappreciated. Even if people's perceptions of the caste are not altered, there is still a feeling of...
It was as if V had never spoken. Sister Gazaden didn't answer V's question or Hannah's. Indeed, she didn't seem affected in the slightest, except, V realized later, that she'd forgotten to teach the last portion of her lecture in triads.
That's all. Class dismissed.
Mama Kay adjusted the topazes hanging in her long hair, examining herself critically in Master Picun's mirror. She'd found a note on her bedside table when she woke. It was written in Durzo's cramped hand.
I live. I will come for you.
That was all. Bothersome man. She'd gotten up and dyed her hair one last time, a natural gray. No silver, she decided. Then she'd come here. It hadn't been easy to order Master Picun to make her blue dress for the coronation more muted and higher cut than any she'd ever worn. But at least his hands had strayed when he took her measurements, as they always did. When his hands stopped wandering, she would know she was old.
You are extraordinary. I have this meeting with every one of my beautiful clients. Normal women make new compromises with age daily, so it's less of a shock to them. Beauties seem to run into it all at once, and it happens here. They ignore my advice and order the latest fashion one more time, and then they see themselves. Some accuse me of making them look bad on purpose. Others stare at the old stranger in the mirror, shocked. And always there are tears.
I'm not much for crying.
You know when I'm only flattering, Guinevere. The body is my canvas, and I tell you, your body is years from that day of tears. You have something ineffable. You walk through life like a dancer, all strength and beauty and grace. I have this client, stunning girl, a bit muscular to be fashionable. I told her to start sitting on her ass and eating chocolates, but saved from being boyish by those hips and tits that would make a goddess green. By Priapus, the girl can wear anything, and will. I'd make her clothes for free just to see her wear them.
Now you're going to make me jealous.
He knew she was kidding, though a small part of her wasn't. Emile Picun was talking about V. Sovari.
What I mean to say is that if I put up portraits of her and you at her age, a man would be hard-pressed to choose between you. But in person, it's no contest. Her beauty is wasted on her. She's divorced from her flesh, joyless. You, on the other hand, have this ability to enjoy a man enjoying you on any of a dozen levels. If I could imbue a dress with what you have, I would not be a tailor, I would be a god. Of all my clients, you will always be my favorite, Guinevere.
She smiled, oddly moved. With Master Bakun, you always expected lechery, but you never expected him to mean anything by it. Now, he meant every word he said.
Thank you, Emil. You warm my heart.
I don't suppose I've warmed any other parts of you,
I'm tempted, but there are so many women who will be needing discounts on their dresses for the coronation. They'd be so disappointed if I exhausted you.
It's cruel to ruin a man by showing him what an artist of the bedchamber can do, and then denying him your talents for 14 years straight.
14?
14 long years.
It has been a long time.
He stepped close. Mama Kay slipped away, opened the door, and beckoned the lithesome noblewoman waiting in the front room.
Careful, sweetie. I think he'll want to start with the discount.
Cruel, Guinevere, cruel!
Janine had been spending her days trying to decide if Gareth Ursul's wives and concubines would die. Dorian waited for her in the black rock halls that she usually lightened with her presence. But today, and for the days since he'd laid the question before her, that sunny presence had been clouded.
My love, we have to decide today.
Part of me hates you for making me decide. But this is what it is to be a queen, isn't it? You are wise, my lord. If you decided for me, I would doubt you either way.
When she'd said, "Part of me hates you," his heart stopped beating. Every god king for centuries had been cremated with his wives and concubines, save for a few concubines that the next god king wished for himself. If Dorian kept his first promise to Janine, every woman in the harems would be obliged to throw themselves, or be thrown, onto Gareth Ursul's pyre, with only the dubious reward of getting to spend all eternity as his slaves. The alternative was to claim all of them, which the Caledorans would see as selfish and dishonoring to the dead. But a god king was not expected to be selfless. There was a third alternative, of course. Dorian could outright ban the practice of throwing the living on funeral pyres. In a few years, he intended to do exactly that. But he was already being painted as a soft southerner. The Verdmeisters were sharks, and Mercy would hatch a dozen plots against his life. What would Solon have told him to do? Dorian pushed the question aside. Solon would have told him to get the hell out of Caledor.
In some ways, if we are to change what marriage is to mean in these lands, it makes sense to let them die. From there, we have a blank slate.
So we throw away 86 women's lives to prove that women have value?
Dorian offered his hand and she took it. They began to walk toward his apartments.
I don't know how to take the cruelty out of the choice.
I don't know if it will work, my lord.
Janine always called him my lord. She couldn't call him Dorian, of course. Your Majesty was too distant. Your Holiness was out of the question, and she knew what Wanhope meant. Despair.
There's something wrong with these girls. Did you know they're taken from their families when they are 9 years old? They've trained to be exactly and only what the God King wants. The only currency they know is the God King's favor. They're not allowed to learn to read. They never go anywhere. They never meet anyone but each other and the eunuchs. It twists them. Yet they're not innocents. They gossip and backstab as much as anyone, perhaps more, because they've nothing useful to occupy them. All the same, they're not animals either, though they've been treated as such. And most of them are just girls. I can't ask them all to die for me. You must claim them, my lord, but I ask this, that you give each the choice. These women have never chosen anything for themselves. Let them choose now.
You think some of them will choose death?
I heard women describe nights with Gareth that left them literally with scars. And they were proud of them. They really believed that your father was a god. Some do want to serve him forever.
Dorian felt like a stranger in his own land. He said nothing as they walked past a knot of aethelings who'd stopped in the hall, prostrating themselves until he passed. At the door of his apartments, he stopped.
Janine, I swear to you that those women will be my concubines in name only. They will not share my bed.
Shh, my love. Don't swear about what you can't control.
Dorian had a sudden sense that he'd done this before. He'd dreamed it just last night, and had forgotten the dream until this moment. But in the dream, there had been a smell, a harsh stench of... what?
If nothing else, I can control myself, my queen.
Thank you, but I won't hold you to it.
I'll hold myself to it.
She squeezed his hand, and then the sharp tang of beer hit his nostrils. He turned to the prostrate Aethelings too late. Two boys without a mustache between them were standing, twin balls of green fire streaking toward Dorian and Janine. They were barely 5 paces away. Dorian watched, expecting the green missiles to pierce his flesh. He was reaching for the Veer, but it was too late to pull a shield together. But then, the Veer was there. Already forming, already acting to protect him. The green missiles were within a hand's breadth when the Veer leapt up, forming a shield that sent the balls of fire streaking back toward their casters. The dead children gaped at him, brains smoking. The living ones didn't dare look up. Fury rushed through Dorian. They hadn't just tried to kill him, they'd tried to kill Janine. He looked at the Verdmeister who was in charge of these Aethelings. The man was cowering, prostrate at the back of the line. Dorian couldn't think. The Veer lashed out from his hand, yanked the man to his feet by his throat. A huge fist of Dorian's Veer smashed his chest against the rock wall. The Aethelings had moved against him. It was a stupid, childish attempt, and it had almost succeeded because he hadn't thought to guard himself against boys who were 8 years old. There had been no follow-up to take advantage of the distraction, so Dorian couldn't know if the children had been directed by a Verdmeister, unless it was simply to test Dorian's strength, or to see if the Veer would save him. In some ways, it wasn't important. What was important was that something had to be done about the Aethelings. They were vipers. If 8 and 9-year-olds had already acted, there was no doubt that the older boys were plotting, and a wedding would give them all sorts of opportunities. Delay looked like weakness, and weakness put not only himself, but also Janine in peril. That he wouldn't tolerate. Kyla was dressed in servant's garb, and there were many new servants in the castle as Tara's retinue meshed with the remnants of Gareth's, which had meshed with the remnants of King Gunder IX's. So, getting into the servants' entrance was no problem. Once inside, he headed to the scullery and grabbed a tray of freshly polished silver goblets, balanced it in one hand, and walked toward the great hall. In the bustle and hum of activity, no one paid any attention to him. He was invisible not because of the Kakari, but because of the practiced anonymity Durzo had spent so many hours teaching him. For the moment, all of the tables were stored in the servants' room adjacent to the great hall. After the coronation, the tables would be carried in fully set. The goblets went on to one of the high tables adjacent to the queen's table. Unfortunately, her table was still empty. It wouldn't be set until immediately before the banquet, and then only under the watchful eyes of the Queen's guard would her cupbearer lay out the castle's finest gold ware for the high table with his own hand. These were not insurmountable difficulties. However, Tara Grayson didn't have a reputation as a drinker, so if Kyla used a poison mild enough that her cupbearer wouldn't be affected when he tested her wine, she might not drink a lethal dose. The same was true of her eating utensils. She was a dainty eater. So, after setting down the goblets, Kyla grabbed a pile of rags dirtied in polishing the tables and headed down a back hallway. He walked purposefully, though he had no idea where the castle's laundry was. He scanned the ceilings and walls for the spy holes and crawl spaces that honeycombed the castle. When he saw a crawl space, he leapt, grabbed the edge with his fingertips, and pulled himself up. From the secret passages, it was only a matter of finding his way. Kyla crawled or walked as the passages required, and kept the Kakari over his eyes so he could see every magical trap. In an hour, he'd found the royal treasury. The opening here was covered by stout iron bars. The Kakari made short work of that.
You know, before you came along, assassinating the Queen would have been hard.
Is there a complaint?
As the sheared bars came off in Kyla's hands, he stopped.
I'm like a god.
The thought jolted him. For some reason, it was the look on Blue's face that did it. Perhaps children didn't bother to cover their awe, or perhaps it was that he had been a blue himself not so long ago. But as he thought about the awe in the guild rats' faces, Carnarvon's Shingas, Hugh Gibbet's, even the God King's face had held a note of awe. For the guild rats, it was a dream. For the others, a nightmare. But the incredulity was the same. He was the impossible. For some reason it had never sunk in. He was still Kyler, maybe still Azoth underneath it all. But now, this was so easy. Kyler had longed to be more than a guild rat. He'd longed to be more than a wet boy. Now, he was more than a man. The rules didn't apply to him. He was stronger than a man, faster, 100 times more powerful. Immortal. Death was temporary. If the most basic mortal concern, dying, didn't apply to him, what else did? It was an intoxicating thought, but a lonely one. If he was more than a man, what communion could he have with men or women? The thought brought Aline sharply to the fore. His chest felt hollow. He would give his other arm if he could be with her again, his head in her lap, her fingers running through his hair, accepting him. Odd that. He could think of Aline with love, but as soon as his thoughts wandered near the hazy line of appreciation and desire, there was V, with her red hair nearly glowing, the curve of her neck begging to be nuzzled, her eyes a challenge, nubile figure tempting him. He could sense her, somewhere far to the east. She was sleeping. He imagined slipping into bed behind her. Her hair was unbound, spilling over her pillow like a copper waterfall. Her hair was glorious, like some god had captured the last rays of the dying sun and given them to her. Kyler leaned close and inhaled deeply. She burrowed into him, her body conforming to his. His breath caught. For a moment, he swore he wasn't wearing any clothes. Then they were back.
What the hell am I doing?
Certain now that he was indeed clothed, Kyler relaxed fractionally. Kyler brushed a lock of hair behind her ear to see her face. She looked somehow smaller, more fragile, but no less beautiful. Without the customary tension, her face looked younger. She looked her age. Unlike Tara Grayson, whom sleep paled, sleep lent V's features grace. Tara Grayson, the castle.
Where the hell am I?
Seeing Gooseflesh rise on V's arm, Kyler pulled the blanket up over both of them. He ran a hand gently from her shoulder down her arm. His hand continued down her hip to her leg. She was wearing a loose, short shift, and he stopped when his hand touched her warm, smooth skin. Then his hand came back up her leg, under her shift. He was a man out of control, his pulse pounding in his ears, the room indistinct, thoughts indistinct, only his nerves alive. Her leg was lean, tight, even in sleep. He trailed his hand over her hip. His fingertips glided over the depression between hip and navel, and then over her dancer's stomach, the perfect blend of warmth and soft over hard. He traced her lowest ribs, glorying in her. Kyler wasn't tall or thickly built, but V's slender form against him made him feel strong and tender and manly. He leaned close, breathing her in, and then he kissed her neck. Gooseflesh rose, and this time he knew it wasn't the cold. He kissed her again, tracing her hairline. His fingers brushed the underside of her breast. Her back arched, grinding her buttocks against his groin. He was naked once more, and her shift had ridden up. She was hot against him.
Yes. Yes.
Kyler!
I'm back. Sorry, I was, elsewhere.
I'm in your body, Kyler. Some things you can't hide from me. Tumescence is one of them.
Tumescence? What the... Oh, God. I didn't want to know that.
Below, through the screen, Kyler saw the door to the treasury open. An officious little man gazed around the barren room. There were only 3 chests. He opened the smallest, and Kyler caught a glimpse of the crown. He went out, closed the door, and began locking the locks. Kyler pulled back the screen and dropped into the room. He pulled the stopper out of the vial, formed the Kakari into its bulb shape, and drew out a generous dose of Phyllodynamis. He stopped the vial and tucked it back into a pouch and grabbed the crown. It was a simple, elegant piece with only a few emeralds and diamonds on it. From the paucity of precious stones and gold in the other chests, Kyler guessed the simplicity had not been a stylistic choice. He modified the Kakari even as he pressed the bulb, giving it a narrow brush at its tip rather than a needle. As quickly as he dared, he drew a narrow band around the inside of the crown with a glob at the back. As soon as Tara Grayson began to sweat under the gold band on her forehead, the bottled fire would wreathe her head in flames, and the glob would cause a small explosion into the back of her head. He didn't want Tara Grayson to be publicly burned. He wanted her dead. If she lived, the people's pity might offset their negative feelings for a time. If she lived, she would accuse Logan of the deed and execute him. The first lines Kyler had painted took on a flat gold sheen close to the color of the crown itself, although Kyler could see some ridges in it. He hoped the damn stuff didn't flake off. Still, he didn't guess that anyone was going to be putting it on before the coronation. It should be fine. He heard a key in the lock at the same time he noticed that the glob of paint at the back of the crown was still wet. Unthinking, Kyler blew on it. He saw one hard edge crack open and turn red. It glowed like a coal for a moment, then dimmed, even as a key went in the second lock. Kyler set the crown down gingerly on the chest and widened the Kakari into a fan. He fanned the crown furiously as the key clicked open the third lock. He drew the Kakari over himself, disappeared, and tried not to breathe. The officious little man held a purple velvet pillow with long gold tassels off the corners. He closed and locked the other two chests, then lifted the crown reverently with two hands, keeping his fingers on the outside, and placed it on the pillow. He walked out of the room. Kyler jumped back up to the open screen, pulled himself into the crawl space, and headed for a place to change into his nobleman's clothing. Tara Grayson was dead. She just didn't know it yet.